Okay, welcome back. This is our final lecture of week 2. We've been talking about the development of political alternatives to autocracy in Russia at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. We talked a little bit about Russian liberalism. We talked about the agrarian socialism of the SR party with their kind of pro-peasant platform of a redistribution of land to give land to the land-hungry peasants. We spoke in broad terms about Marxism in general as it developed in the 19th century. And what I want to do in this lecture is think about how Marxism came to Russia, how Marxism was received in Russia at the end of the 19th century, and how it developed. Because again, it's the radical Marxists, the Bolsheviks, who will come to power in Russia following the October Revolution. So we sort of need to think a little bit about how that came to be. So let me go back to the PowerPoint that we were looking at before. And again, you probably have these terms written down already, but here we are. So let's think about Marxism and how Marxism was received in Russia. Ironically, the very first foreign translation of Das Kapital, of Marx's Capital, was the Russian translation, which appeared in 1872, just 5 years after Capital appeared in German. Now, for books to be published in the Russian Empire, they had to go through the censorship process. They had to be vetted, they had to be approved, they had to receive a literal stamp of approval from the Imperial Censorship Board. Why? Because the autocracy, as you might imagine, did not want to see in print radical revolutionary texts calling for the overthrow of the system. So how on earth did a Russian translation of Marx's Capital appear in the Russian Empire in 1872? The censor, a man named Skuratov, gave it the official stamp of approval, writing, "Few people in Russia will read this book, fewer still will understand it." The censor was wrong. The first run of 3,000 copies sold out very quickly, and by 1880, Marx was writing to his friend Zorga that our success is greater still in Russia, where Capital is read and appreciated more than anywhere else. Marx found this interesting, again, because he thought that the first domino to fall in the global socialist revolution would be England or France or Belgium or Germany. Why were the Russians reading this book? Marx was a bit bemused. Marxism found its first Russian advocate in the person of Georgy Plekhanov, often known as the father of Russian Marxism. Plekhanov, like many radicals of his generation, began as a populist. He was a founding member of the Going to the People movement in 1873. He was a founding member of the Land and Freedom revolutionary movement in 1876. But like many Russian radicals in the early 1880s, he was at a bit of a loss. The Going to the People movement had failed. We hadn't been able to convince the peasants to join us in revolution. Assassinating Tsar Alexander II in 1881 had failed. We blew up Alexander II only to get an even worse Tsar, Alexander III. So if we can't go to the people, if we can't just blow up autocrats and achieve revolutionary change, how are we going to do it? Plekhanov, like many, finds the answers to the questions he's asking in the writings of Karl Marx. Plekhanov becomes, if you will, a convert to the ideas and theories and roadmap of Karl Marx. Plekhanov reading Marx tries to figure out where Russia stands on that trajectory of historical development. Now, we saw this trajectory last time. I'll just show it to you again. Remember, Marx says that industrial Europe, with industrial capitalist economies, is in this stage right here, the stage of capitalism, right? Plekhanov, looking around at the Russia of the late 19th century, says, we're somewhere on this arc. You know, we've just left the feudal stage in 1861 with the emancipation of the serfs. And we're gradually, quickly enough, but only gradually entering capitalism. So Plekhanov's argument is that capitalism has only just barely begun in Russia. And so the socialist revolution, which is inevitable, is a long ways away. Plekhanov says that Russia must first go through the full stage of capitalist development, right? Russia must go through the kind of economic and social maturation that the rest of Western and Central Europe has already undergone. We're a long way away. The socialist revolution is inevitable, Plekhanov says, but it could be generations down the road. Plekhanov does not believe that he will live to see the socialist revolution. Now again, what attracted Plekhanov and other men and women of his generation was the scientific assurance built into Marxism, right? That history was moving forward. There might be some dips and wiggles along the way, but history is moving forward to socialism and from socialism to true communism. So there's a sort of certainty, a sort of certitude, a sort of assurance, a promise built into Marxism that if the revolutionaries follow this roadmap that Marx has laid out, our hopes and our lives will not be sacrificed in vain. History is moving forward. The iron laws of history are inexorable. But in Russia, Plekhanov argues, it's going to take a while. So Plekhanov espouses, advocates a very orthodox, small o, orthodox, literal reading of Marx. If the socialist revolution can only come when capitalism has reached its full oppressive maturity, then Russia has to go through all of that pain before we can make the jump into socialism. So just as Marx himself believed that the revolution would inevitably come first in the most industrialized countries where capitalism had deepest and most exploitative roots, and only then spread to the rest of the world, so too believed Plekhanov. So for Plekhanov, the idea was that we will lay the groundwork. We Russian Marxists will reach out to the workers, we'll teach the workers the basic principles of Marxism, we'll show them what they're fighting for, we'll lay down the path that they will follow, and in generations to come, in the fullness of time, Russia will be ready for the socialist revolution. So we just have to sit back and wait, Plekhanov says. So again, there's that comfort of knowing that the change you desire is inevitable. And that's what attracts so many Russians at the end of the 19th century to the Marxist gospel. But the awareness that that change may be many years down the road, many decades down the road, that you yourself may not live to see it, is disconcerting to some. It's certainly disconcerting to Lenin, to whom we'll now turn. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov is Lenin's real name. Ulyanov, or Lenin, the future Lenin, is born in the town of Simbirsk on the Volga River in 1870. His grandfather had been a serf. His father had been born a free man and risen through the bureaucracy to a very comfortable position in the imperial civil service. He worked in the Department or Ministry of Education. His mother came from a very comfortable line of doctors. The family was upper middle class. So the irony, perhaps, is that the leader of the proletarian workers' revolution came from decidedly bourgeois stock. I want to say just a bit about this name issue, right? Lenin's real name is Ulyanov. Why do we call him Lenin? As a young Marxist revolutionary, Ulyanov goes through the traditional rite of passage. He adopts a revolutionary alias, and he calls himself Lenin. It's thought that Lenin comes from the Lena River in Siberia, which in the early 20th century was a major site of the Russian gold mining industry, and where striking miners had been brutally shot down by, by Tsarist forces. And so, in a sort of show of solidarity for the slaughtered working class, Ulyanov adopts the revolutionary pseudonym of Lenin. Now, for revolutionaries, adopting an alias, if you will, was in part pragmatic. Russian revolutionaries needed to try and stay a few steps ahead of the Tsarist police, so they often used multiple aliases. But there was also a kind of symbolic, quasi-religious overtone to this process of renaming. Taking on a revolutionary alias represented the revolutionary himself or herself adopting a new identity. It represented his or her kind of new political rebirth, a sort of revolutionary baptism, in essence. So it's a kind of revolutionary reworking of the traditional Orthodox Christian sacrament of baptism, taking on a new personhood. And all of the great figures of the Russian Revolution, not only Bolsheviks, but other political parties too, many of them, I shouldn't say all, many of them went through this kind of rite of passage. Stalin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, other figures that we'll talk about, these are not their real names, right? These are not the names they were born with. These are the aliases they adopted as part of this self-reinvention, becoming a revolutionary, taking on a new identity. So Lenin is born, as I said, in 1870, out in the provinces, into an upper middle class family. He has a very comfortable childhood. He's a model student. When he graduates from the city high school, he receives the gold medal, which is sort of, makes him the kind of valedictorian of his graduating class. By an ironic twist of fate, the man who presents young Lenin with his gold medal on the day of his high school graduation is the father of Alexander Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, whom Lenin will topple in October of 1917. So rather ungracious payback for the medal bestowed on him by Kerensky's father, the superintendent of schools. Lenin had planned to go off to university to become a lawyer, but a very important event happens, a turning point happens in his life in 1887. Here you see a photo of the young Lenin in the year 1887. He's wearing the sort of military style uniform that boys wore in the imperial high schools. You see the high collar and the buttons. In 1887, young Lenin's older brother, Alexander, is arrested for taking part in an unsuccessful assassination attempt on the Tsar, Alexander III. A lot of student radicals set their sights on high-profile targets. Lenin's brother, Alexander, Sasha, the family nickname for him was Sasha. Lenin's older brother is involved in one of these radical plots. They try to kill the Tsar. They fail spectacularly, but the conspirators in the plot are arrested, and Lenin's brother, Sasha, is executed for treason in 1887. And this is a huge blow to young Lenin. Little Vladimir, the future Lenin, had idolized his older brother. And after his brother's death, little Lenin reads voraciously all of his dead brother's books, especially the 1863 novel, What is to be Done, by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. And those of you who took History 357 will maybe recall Chernyshevsky's novel, What is to be Done, a kind of how-to manual for would-be radicals. Lenin reads it, and he is enraptured by this alternative lifestyle of radical opposition. He desires to follow in his brother's footsteps. And in the years to come, Lenin will come to realize that the path down which his brother went is a dead end. Killing the Tsar, even so hated a Tsar as Alexander III, is only going to give you another Tsar, right? You cannot achieve fundamental, meaningful change to the system through the bomb-hurling tactics of the populists, the forerunners of the SRs. So how then can we achieve meaningful change? If populism and bomb-throwing is a dead end, if going to the people, the peasants, is a dead end, what are we going to do? What is to be done? The question posed in the title of Lenin's favorite novel, a book that he read 5 times one summer. Lenin finds the answers that he's looking for in the writings of Karl Marx. At the age of 19, in 1889, he reads Das Kapital, Capital. He will later describe it as a personal revelation. It leads to his political conversion. When he goes off to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, to attend law school, he joins a Marxist reading group. And here you see Lenin seated with his fellow comrades in the St. Petersburg underground Marxist reading group. This photograph is taken in the 1890s. Lenin is still only in his mid-20s at this point. His nickname in the party is the Old Man, in part because of his premature baldness, but also because of the authority and respect that he wields and enjoys within this small, tightly knit circle. Already in the 1890s, still in his 20s, Lenin acquires a deserved reputation for being a very voracious reader and a vicious debater, a vicious polemicist who will rip his opponents apart in debates and in pamphlets. He has decided to become, and all the men in this photograph have resolved to become, professional revolutionaries. Now that term may seem to be a contradiction, but in the late 19th century, when radicals talked about being a professional revolutionary, what they meant was that every waking moment of their life, all of their assets, all of their resources, all of their energies had to be devoted to the cause of revolution. Anything else was a distraction and an encumbrance. And distractions and encumbrances ought to be cast aside so that the individual can devote full attention and full effort to the cause, the revolution. Lenin himself later said that he gave up his 2 passions in life as a young man because they distracted him needlessly from revolutionary activity. He gave up smoking, and he gave up going to concerts and listening to classical music. He adored Beethoven, but he said, when you listen to Beethoven, your head is filled with all of these syrupy, sweet notions of human brotherhood and sort of romantic visions of unity, and you've got to shake it out of your head and get back to the real business at hand, revolution. In the 1890s, Lenin begins to research, to write, and publish. He befriends Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism, but he's frustrated with Plekhanov. He goes abroad to Paris to visit Plekhanov, and he's frustrated that Plekhanov seems so rigid in his insistence that Russian revolution is decades or even generations away. Lenin conducts his own research. He goes through government statistical manuals. He studies agricultural reports from the Russian provinces. He studies reports on the production of Russian industry. And what he finds, and what he argues in his book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, published at the end of the 1890s, is that by his reckoning, by his numbers, Russia is much more advanced in the realm of capitalism than Plekhanov and others have recognized. And the implications of Lenin's findings in that book are very important. If capitalism is more fully developed, more robust, more mature in Russia than Plekhanov and others had hitherto seen, then what that means is that we are closer to the socialist revolution here in Russia than others have others have hitherto acknowledged. So that's an important contribution, and it's a controversial one, that Lenin introduces into the small circle of Russian Marxists of which he is a member. Not long after this photograph was taken, Lenin and his comrades were arrested by the St. Petersburg police in 1897. Lenin is sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. Again, Siberia is that vast, largely empty expanse of geographical space east of the Ural Mountains, rich in natural resources, but very sparsely populated. And Siberia was a popular dumping ground, if you will, for the czarist regime to get rid of undesirables, not only common criminals, rapists, murderers, arsonists, thieves, but also political enemies, men and women like Lenin, who had written dangerous texts, who needed to be kept out of the way, who needed to be sent off to Siberia so they couldn't cause trouble in the major cities. Now, in the Tsarist period, being sentenced to Siberia did not mean what it would mean in Russia after the October Revolution. Stalin, for instance, has, as we'll see, a whole network of labor camps to which common criminals and political criminals are sentenced, essentially to be worked, if not to death, at least awfully close. Lenin, by contrast, lives in a little cottage in this small Siberian village. He has books. He has writing materials. This is a far more cushy sentence than he and his comrades would impose upon their own enemies after 1917. And in fact, during his 3 years of exile in Siberia, Lenin publishes a number of pamphlets, a number of brochures and small books that help to build his reputation as the senior figure in the Russian Marxist movement, even coming to eclipse Plekhanov. In 1900, after his sentence is over, Lenin spends some time in the capital. He goes to some of the provincial towns. He meets with various Marxist comrades. He builds up important networks and friendships that will play a role in the events of 1917. But he spends most of the next 17 years, from 1900 until the spring of 1917, he spends most of those years outside of Russia. And during that 17-year period, in his writings, in his letters, Lenin is engaged in a project of trying to fit Marxism into the Russian reality, trying to take, the round sphere of Marxism and jam it into the square peg of Russian reality. And Lenin introduces some, let's call them innovations, into classical Orthodox Marxism. His opponents would call them heretical deviations. But Lenin argues that these innovations are necessary in order to make Marxism work in Russia. And what Lenin wants more than anything else is to make the socialist revolution happen in his lifetime. If Plekhanov is content to have it 2 or 3 generations down the road, Lenin wants it as quickly as possible. One of Lenin's most important innovations, and the one I want to focus on in our discussion on Friday and in our lecture here today, is his theory on the role of the party. Marx had talked about the Communist Party, a party of professional revolutionaries. Lenin really emphasizes and creates a new role for the party to play in the revolution that will come. So before he went into Siberian exile, Lenin, while he was in the capital, had spent some time working in the St. Petersburg factories, not working as a factory worker, but doing propaganda work, kind of doing missionary work, if you will. He was trying to convert factory workers to the gospel of Marxism, acquaint them with Marx's message, win them over to the side of revolution. For Lenin, this was both a rewarding and frustrating experience. Rewarding in the sense that he did win over many factory workers, men and women, mostly metal workers, mostly the skilled workers, but textile workers as well. He did win over many workers. He helped organize the workers into committees, illegal committees, that could push for higher wages, strike for better conditions. But it was a frustrating experience for Lenin because he soon came to realize that the workers with whom he interacted were primarily interested in economic questions, more so than in political questions. As he wrote at the time, in the 1890s, the workers did not have, nor was it possible for them to have, an awareness of the irreconcilable contradiction between their interests and the whole modern political social system, i.e., capitalism. There's a lot going on in that quote. What does he mean? The workers did not have, nor was it possible for them to have, an awareness that their present condition was irreconcilable with the existing political, social, economic system of autocratic capitalism. So what Lenin feared was that if the workers were left to their own devices, they would not attempt a socialist revolution on their own. Lenin did not share Marx's rather breezy confidence that the proletariat, the workers, would one day, on their own, band together, topple capitalism, usher in the socialist order. If they were left to their own devices, they're going to push for economic goals, more modest and more easily achievable goals. Higher wages, better working conditions, greater, more respectful treatment from their foremen and employers. Lenin says, look at what the striking workers in Russian factories are calling for today. They're calling for a 10-hour workday and higher wages. They're not calling for an overthrow of the autocratic system. They're not calling for a complete overhaul of the capitalist order. This kind of worker action, Lenin said, just striking for a 10-hour day, striking for better wages, was like putting a bandage on a gaping wound. Right? It doesn't resolve the fundamental problem beneath the gauze. Right? He called this trade union consciousness. Workers left to their own devices, on their own, were capable only of achieving trade union consciousness. They were capable only of pushing for economic interests. They couldn't see the bigger political picture. Not because they were stupid, not because they were ignorant, not because they were of a lower social status than Lenin and his comrades, but because the capitalist system had beat them down to the point that all they could see was the next day in front of them. All they could conceive of was earning a few extra rubles in their paycheck to cover their rent, feed their families, clothe their children. They can't make, the workers, Lenin said, can't make that jump from trade union consciousness, which is purely economic, to revolutionary consciousness, which embraces both an economic and political dimension. They can't make that leap on their own. Left to their own devices, they're never going to call for worker control over the means of production. So how do we solve this problem? How do we get the workers on board the locomotive of revolution, right? Well, Lenin wrestled with this question for a very long time, and he put forward a solution in his 1902 pamphlet titled "What is to be Done?" And here you see the title page of the first edition, published, of course, abroad in the German town of Stuttgart, because it could not be published, so revolutionary a text, could not be published in Russia. What is to be done? The biggest questions facing our movement. Lenin, the title, What is to be Done, of course, is an homage to the 1863 novel by Chernyshevsky that had so inspired him in his youth. So the title itself, and I've asked you to read excerpts from What is to be Done, we'll discuss it this week in lecture. The title of the pamphlet itself poses a question. If the workers can't achieve revolutionary consciousness on their own, what is to be done? If they can't achieve it on their own, Lenin says, they'll have to get it from outside. And so Lenin's solution to the title question, what is to be done, is the creation of a tightly knit, top secret, conspiratorial underground party of professional revolutionaries who will, when the time is right, lead the workers forward to revolution. The party will be the vanguard of revolution. And when political philosophers talked about the vanguard at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, what they meant was at the forefront. Right? The party that Lenin envisioned would lead the workers forward when the time was right. So what Lenin has done is integrate some old currents of Russian radicalism from the 19th century, the idea of professional, devoted, dedicated, hardcore, full-time revolutionaries. He's taken that kind of Russian tradition of 19th century radicalism and he's grafted it onto traditional Orthodox Marxism from the writings of Marx and Engels. So instead of sitting back and waiting, like Plekhanov said, when the time is right, the Revolutionary Party will lead the workers forward and we will force history's hand. In other words, we can make the jump, the revolutionary leap from capitalism into socialism by sheer force of will. We will hurry forward the iron laws of history. And Lenin's determination to go faster and faster, and the determination of his maybe more orthodox comrades in the Marxist movement to say, wait, we're not ready yet. This becomes a common refrain and theme when we get to 1917. Lenin is relentlessly pushing forward. Those who follow him are on his side, but others in the Russian Marxist movement are saying, hold on, you're going too fast. So all of this comes out of what is to be done. One of the most important texts in revolutionary Russian history, and again, it's a tweak. It's a not a bug, but a feature. Lenin is trying to make Marxism work. When the pamphlet appears in 1902, it generates enormous controversy. Plekhanov and his supporters accused Lenin of being elitist, of taking a too dim view of the ability of workers to form and organize and move the movement forward. And the pamphlet, What is to be Done, becomes the principal item on the agenda of the 1903 Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, the Russian Marxist Party, an illegal underground party. They have to meet in London because they can't meet in Russia. They're kicked out of Brussels in Belgium, and they eventually, those who aren't arrested, make their way to London. The Second Congress of the Russian Marxist Party is called into session in 1903. And again, the number one item on the agenda is what is to be done. Lenin's pamphlet is at the very heart of the debates. And it becomes a breaking point for the Russian Marxist movement. Lenin's old friend, Yuli Martov, shown here, the same man sitting at the table with Lenin in that photo from the 1890s, one of Lenin's most trusted friends, his most trusted comrades in the Russian Marxist movement, denounces Lenin. Martov denounces Lenin's ideas about the party at the Second Congress. Martov says, no, the party should be open to all. It must be inclusive. We must welcome into our ranks anyone who is opposed to autocracy. We must ally ourselves with all the enemies of autocracy, because our enemy's enemy is our friend. We will work with the liberals, we will work with the socialist revolutionaries, the SRs, to build a broad base to bring down the autocracy. And then we will make way when the time is right, whenever that may be. We may be dead, but we will pave the way for the eventual socialist revolution. As Martov put it, quoting Plekhanov, we Marxists must be the midwives of socialism. We must wait by the bedside, and when the time is right, assist in the birth of the new socialist order. That's the position that Martov is taking at the 1903 Congress. Most of the delegates are on Martov's side. Lenin doubles down on the argument he made in What is to be Done. He's like, look, we don't need an open party. This isn't the Elks Club. This isn't a social group. This isn't a charitable organization. We don't need a lot of members. We need good members. We need steadfast, professional, hardcore, totally dedicated revolutionaries. Better to have fewer members, but better quality members, better caliber members. We don't need to collaborate with the liberals. They're not our allies. They're not our comrades. They just want a constitution. The constitution is a fine thing, but we want something more, Lenin reminds the delegates at the London Congress. We want a fundamental reorganization of the social and political system, the economic base, and we want it now. So the 1903 Congress held in London is a really big turning point in the history of the Russian Marxist movement. Martov and his buddies are arguing that the Marxists ought to be the midwives of socialism, waiting to assist the birth when the time is right. Lenin and his comrades are saying, rather than just wait at the bedside, we ought to induce labor, right? We ought to speed the process forward. So the Congress devolves into a shouting match. Old friendships are broken. Martov and Lenin never repair their old friendship. Um, Many of the Marxists just walk out, storm out of the Congress in disgust. And so when a vote is finally taken, Lenin and his comrades manage to walk away from the Congress with the slimmest of majorities. And that will allow Lenin's faction, his wing of the Russian Marxist movement, to be called the Bolsheviks. The word Bolshevik um, comes from the Russian word большинство, which means majority. And because half of the Congress had already walked out, Lenin and his supporters did have a majority at the end of the day at the 1903 Congress. They call themselves the Bolsheviks, the majority wing of the Marxist Party, leaving poor Martov and his supporters to bear the far less flattering sobriquet of Mensheviks, those representing the minority. Again, a minority only because by the time the vote was taken, so many delegates on Martov's side had stormed out in protest that Lenin had been able to carry the day. So this is the very first example, I think, in Lenin's political career of the manipulation of political language for political gain. We'll see more of that to come. Because of his stubborn commitment to the principles he laid out in What Is to Be Done, Lenin has managed to divide the Russian Marxist movement, to split it in two. And he's isolated the biggest names, the leading lights in the Russian Marxist movement. Not only Martov, but Dan, Axelrod, Tsereteli, others, names that aren't important for our purposes, but the biggest stars shining, if you will, in the Marxist heavens, over as a horrible metaphor there, mangled. So let me just back up and say the biggest stars in the Russian Marxist movement after 1903 are on the Menshevik side. Lenin has, in fact, a smaller cohort of supporters. Even Trotsky, who will become Lenin's right-hand man in 1917, a key figure in the planning and execution of the October Revolution, even Trotsky sides with the Mensheviks for years, 1903 to 1917. How do we keep these two wings apart? I just want to stress again, if we think of that midwife metaphor, that Martov and the Mensheviks are kind of the gradualist wing of the Russian Marxist movement. And they're very similar to the social democratic, i.e. moderate Marxist parties that have seats in European parliaments in Germany, in London, in the Austrian Empire. So the Mensheviks are kind of the evolutionary Marxist party. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, are the revolutionary Marxist party. So that's kind of a reductive, but I think easy way to keep those two wings apart. So what I've tried to do this week is sketch out some sense of the political landscape in Russia as alternatives to autocracy are being formed. Liberalism, agrarian socialism, Marxism in both its Menshevik and Bolshevik guises. The radicals agree that change is needed, but they disagree on what kind of change we want. Think back, if you will, to the model of dual polarization that I shared with you last week, the thesis model put forward by the historian Leopold Haemsen. As Russia enters the 20th century, not only is the regime divided from society, but within society itself, deep, irreparable structural fault lines are opening up. And it makes a compromise impossible. If we think back, I'm going to stop the share. If we think back to that model I showed you in the previous lecture of the kind of various political parties forming, had there been some kind of grand coalition of socialist revolutionaries, Marxists, and liberals that could have come together to topple the autocracy and create something new in its place, the whole course of 20th century history, not just in Russia, but globally, would be changed. By sheer happenstance, I don't want to say accident, but by sheer happenstance, Lenin's tiny little clique of devoted hardcore supporters will come to power in Russia in October 1917, and not only change that country dramatically, but change the course of history. I've said before, and it's worth maybe repeating, that there's nothing inevitable in the course of human history. Things that we might think of as preordained or bound to be are in fact, at best, just very highly probable. Now, if you were a betting man or woman in 1903, 1904, 1905, and someone said, what do you think the chances are that the Bolsheviks will come to power within a decade? You would have laughed, taken their odds, and won their money. No one thought in 1907 that the Bolsheviks would be in power just 10 short years later. In 1907, in a country with a population of 130 million, there are barely 150,000 Bolsheviks and Mensheviks combined. 150,000 card-carrying Marxists in a country of 130 million people. Numbers are not on their side. So how do we make sense of that Bolshevik victory in 1917? The Bolsheviks would say it's inevitable. It's not. But I want us next week, as we turn to that revolutionary year, 1917, to really think about the social and economic and political factors that made Lenin's victory possible in the fall of 1917. That's the question we're going to turn to next week. And so we'll think about what made the Bolshevik program, their platform, appealing to Russian audiences as 1917 approached. So that's what we're going to be getting to next week. This week, again, we have our discussion on Friday. Read through the excerpts from What Is to Be Done. Read the selection from the ABC of Communism, and we'll go over any questions you may have from the lecture as well. Okay? So I look forward to seeing you virtually on Friday and having a good, robust, fun discussion. Okay? So thanks for your patience, and I will talk to you soon.